Genesis chapter 48. We'll continue the story of Jacob and Joseph tonight. We only have, let's see, 2 more lessons here in Genesis, and then after we get through Genesis, we're going to switch over to the book of Daniel. So if you want to be studying ahead, you can kind of be looking a little bit at the book of Daniel. This is one of those studies, some studies to me are more interesting than others. This is one that I would deem probably one of those lesser interesting studies, but there's obviously a reason why this is in there, things that God wanted us to know and learn from them. And so that's what we're going to do tonight, Lord willing. Let's start with our discussion question. Question number 1 on your handout. And that is, why do some people care where they are buried whenever they die? I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, but is there anybody here who cares where they're buried? Whenever you pass from this life, you thought about it?
A lot of people like to be buried by their family.
Yeah. And why do you think that is?
It's a closeness.
Yeah. I think it's death is one of those uncomfortable things, and I think the thought of your body being placed next to those who you lived with and cared for is a little bit of comfort in a difficult time. Anything else?
Well, the tombstones tell a family history. Look at generations.
Yeah.
Actually, sometimes do research on family.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you can get a pretty good family tree just by, looking through the cemetery and, like you said, reading the headstones. I guess I've always told my wife I'm one of those people, I don't care what she does with me or my body when I die. I said, throw it in a pine box or burn it or cremate me or, put me wherever you want. I'm not going to be there, so it doesn't bother me what happens to my body. But as we read about Jacob, did he have concern about his body, where it would be buried? Yeah, and he had a pretty unique request whenever, I guess we'll talk more about it as we get toward the end of this chapter and, of course, the end of the next. But he had a pretty unique request whenever it came to his burial. And, a lot of people look at where Jacob was, which we've obviously learned, throughout our studies that he's now in the land of Egypt. But the Egyptians were experts whenever it came to preparing bodies for burials, weren't they? I mean, they were some of the top escalon of that day and age of people who had the ability to embalm, people who had the ability to preserve. But the body, was Jacob really concerned about his body? Was that what his main concern was? Yeah. He wasn't really concerned, I think, about, necessarily his body itself and what would happen to it. But he did want it buried in a specific place, a specific land. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. New Testament Hebrew writer has something to say about Jacob and that request that he made. But let's talk a little bit about chapter 48 here, and we'll get a little bit deeper into the discussion of his burial as we go. What does Joseph do? Question number 2 on your handout. What does Joseph do whenever he heard that his father was ill? Yeah, I think he did what all of us would probably do, right? And it seems like at this point, now, the Bible says he actually became sick. So I don't know if he, contracted some sickness in his older age. A lot of times that's the case as people get older, they're more prone to sickness. And sometimes, contracting a sickness will eventually wind up what causes them to die. But he became very ill to the point that it's pretty obvious at this time that he's bedridden. And we read a little bit later on, and I think it's verse 8, his eyesight, was failing. And I think he knew, and I think everybody around him knew that the end of his time was drawing near. And so either he probably calls for Joseph or has them call for Joseph. And like any son would do for his dying father, Joseph took his 2 sons, he rushed to his side, as quickly as he could get there. A few things to kind of think about, and know some of these things, whenever you talk about death, people don't often like to speak about death. We like to pretend that it doesn't exist and doesn't happen. That makes it, I guess, more comforting to some people. But question number 3 is a pretty good question to think about. What sort of things becomes important to a person when he or she knows that they're going to die soon? When you read about Jacob here, Jacob knows he's getting ready to pass from this land. What are the things that are important to him? Yeah, it's important. He wants to get his family, in as orderly of a structure as he can. And it's one of those events in life where it kind of puts things in perspective. Jacob doesn't call Joseph in there to talk about money, does he? He doesn't call him in there to talk about all the animals they have and, what are we going to do with them whenever. That's not his focus and his concern. And so all that matters to Jacob at this point is things that we would think of that would, go beyond this world. And of course, he speaks about God. He tells all of his sons. He tells all of his sons about God, what God did for him, what God would do for them. And those are the type of things that become important, I think, at death. You think about your family, think about their spiritual well-being, you think about the future and what it holds. And, if we do have a chance to speak to our family before we depart from this life, I think all of us, that would be one of the first things that would be on our minds. Question number 4 here. So what do people often do to prepare for death? Okay, pretty common thing to have a will before we pass from this life, right? Why do we do that?
You're prepared for your family, doesn't have to deal with it.
Yeah, it's you want your family. You want it to be as easy on your family as you can. And one of the things I think whenever you depart from this life or you're going to, that you think ahead, you think, I don't want them to have to deal with this or even think about it. I just want it to be, put down in writing, here's what I want, here's what's going to happen, and kind of help them move on. A lot of people, prepare for their funeral before they die, don't they? They go ahead and, they buy their casket, they put their funeral procession in order, what they want, how they want things done, things like that. That's one of the things that, again, I think people do because it helps ease somewhat the burden upon those who are closest to you. And so you think about Jacob here, I think the first thing that all of us do to prepare for death is we get our life in order first, right? We got to be ready to meet God first. And once you got that done, I think then you start thinking about, well, what about all this stuff and what about all my family? And over the years, and I think it probably gets worse as we progress as a nation, but I think one of the things that all of us don't want is our family fighting over the things that we own, to possess it. And so it's just a lot easier to write it down in a will, and that doesn't work all the time either. But it kind of speeds up the process and I guess helps out through some of those difficult times.
Unfortunately, that's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
A lot of the time.
Yeah. And you think about it too. Think about your children and your family. You wouldn't want one of your children to get everything you had, would you? You'd want it divided up fairly and you want things done as fairly as possible with all your children, all your family. And so that's just things that we do when we prepare for death. You'll see glimpses of that as you read through Jacob's conversation with Joseph. Also, he's going to talk to the rest of his sons in chapter 49. But it's just human nature, things that we deal with, things that we think about. And, if you want something specific, said at your funeral. One of the hard things for me as a preacher is sometimes when you preach a funeral, you think, well, what do I say? Or what would they want me to say? I always love it when the family comes to you and say, hey, they thought about this beforehand, and here's what they wanted for their funeral. That's always a good thing too. But I mean, if you think about it, those are some of the last impressions that are to be made on people in this world from our lives here. And so I think what's said at our funeral is important. I think what's on our headstone is pretty important too. But they're kind of the last witness and testimony or some of it, that we're going to have here upon this earth. But Jacob is preparing for death, and so he's trying to get things in order as good as he can. And he's trying to make sure that his sons are prepared to carry on this lineage, carry on this plan that God has for them as a nation and as a people, and to prioritize God in their lives. Question number 5. So what did Jacob tell Joseph in verses 3 through 7 there? What are their conversation like? What do they talk about?
Talking about the nation promise.
He tells him about some of those divine experiences that he had while serving God here on this earth. Jacob was one of those people that you read about in the Bible that God appeared to at different times. And he talks about, this time when God appeared to him. I don't know if he's referring to the time at Bethel or the time at Luz. I don't know which one he specifically has in mind, but God does appear to him in both of those places. It says basically the same thing that he talks about here, like Steve pointed out. He reminds them about these promises that God had made to them. And those promises basically revolved around them becoming a great nation, very powerful, very numerous, mighty nation, and also the land that God was going to give to them as an inheritance. And so he reminds them of these great promises that God has made for each one of them. Let's see here. He also mentions the death of Rachel. One of the things that stands out about Jacob's life here upon this earth is, even though he talks about, God was with him and all these great promises were made to him, was it an easy life? Was it free of any turmoil or trouble or conflict? No. But it was bearable. I mean, he could live it. He could bear it. He could live with it here upon this earth. And so he talks a little bit about the death of his beloved wife, Rachel. Of course, that would have been Joseph's mother. But he also assures Joseph that here's one of the things that Jacob had learned throughout his life. God is going to do what he tells you he's going to do. And so he reminds him about these promises. One day God's going to fulfill these promises. You guys got to be ready. You got to remain faithful. You got to pick up the torch and carry it, so to speak. And you got to inherit these great promises that God has prepared for us as a nation. Question number 6 here. So what does Jacob ask Joseph? Verses 8 through 10.
Well, you want Joseph to bring his sons.
Yeah. And remember that at this point, Jacob can't see very well, right? His eyesight is failing him. And so he probably recognizes that there's these two figures with Joseph. And he said, who's that guy with you? Right?
Well, this goes back to who if you think about this eye, this is a very similar thing.
Yeah.
Bless them and hope you.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon throughout the book of Genesis. One of the things that you'll find is the birthright didn't always go to the oldest son, did it? Now, according to man, that's probably who men would have chosen, but God didn't always choose the same people that men would have chosen. But of course, he asked him about who was there. Of course, Joseph said, "Those are my two sons." And what you learn about in this chapter is basically Jacob adopts those two grandsons and puts them in the place of his own sons. That's why they become a tribe within the land, or within the promised land. You have the tribe of Manasseh and Ephraim. And so, why did he do that for Joseph? Yeah, Joseph got the birthright. Okay, remember we talked a little bit about it before. Who was supposed to get the birthright? Yeah, the oldest. Anybody remember who that was? Reuben. Yeah, why didn't he get the birthright? Yeah, remember he slept with his father's concubine, and so that would have disqualified him. You had Simeon next. After him, you had Levi. Remember, I think in Genesis 34, they went out and murdered a bunch of people, and so they didn't get the birthright either. But Jacob ends up getting the birthright, and what did that mean? What was the blessing of the birthright? Yeah, they got double what everybody else got. And so if you look at the tribes of Israel, there's no tribe named Joseph, right? But he does have two tribes through his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And so everybody else just got one, but he got the double portion because he got the birthright. And so that's what Jacob's talking about here. He's basically adopting them as his own sons, and he's saying, I'm going to recognize them as, instead of you, I'm going to recognize them as being instead of my sons.
Didn't that birthright give them more status, or more than just things?
Yeah.
Possessions. It give them status as the lineage.
Yeah.
Was kind of traced down through them.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? And so that was, again, you think about all these children. Christ had to come through one. He couldn't come through both, right? And so you had to choose somebody. That's the progress through the Old Testament. Who's Christ going to descend through? Well, it's not always the oldest, right? That wasn't always the most important to God. It was the godly ones. That's who God chose, godly lineage through whom Christ would come. But yeah, you're right about, basically they were kind of the next patriarch of the family. The firstborn, or the guy who got the birthright at least. I guess that's in part because he had twice as much as everybody else. But that's what Jacob is telling Joseph here. He's going to adopt his two sons as his own sons. And so Manasseh and Ephraim are going to have an inheritance. They're going to have a tribe or a part in the promised land. Let's see. Question number 7 here. So what did Jacob say he never expected?
He never thought he would see Joseph.
Yeah. Remember, he thought Joseph had died. And how long did that go on for? Remember? It was over 20 years, about 22 years that went on before Jacob found out that Joseph was alive. And so he never, in his lifetime, he never expected that he'd ever see Joseph again. Sure didn't expect he'd ever see any sons belonging to Joseph, any grandsons through him. But, of course, God had blessed him. Not only blessed him to be able to see Joseph, but he also got to see grandchildren that were born to him through Joseph. Question number 8, whom did Joseph bring before Jacob, and what did Jacob do?
Joseph brought his two sons for Jacob to bless.
Yeah, he brought Manasseh and he brought Ephraim. Who was the firstborn?
Manasseh's firstborn.
Okay, so should have got the inheritance, right? And so how does Jacob line them up?
Put the younger on the front side.
Yeah. So you have this. Let me see here. I'm trying to read without my glasses. It's not working very good. Yeah, verse 17. Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim. It displeased him, so he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. So when Joseph brings them before Jacob, he kind of sets them in the order where the person who got the right hand of Jacob got the blessing. And so he puts Manasseh over there, and then Ephraim's on the left hand, but when Jacob lays his hand on him, he crosses his hands and puts them on his head. And so Jacob understood. He was old and he couldn't see, but he did it on purpose, right? Wasn't an accident what he was doing here, but he knew that the blessing or the birthright was going to be given to the younger son. Now I want you to stop just a minute, think back through kind of the history of mankind, and think about the times that the firstborn didn't receive the birthright. Can you name some of them?
So we got the birthright.
Okay. Yeah, that's going to be a little bit later on. Let's go back through Genesis here. Okay, Jacob's one of the examples, right? Remember Jacob and Esau were twins. Esau was born first, but Jacob got the birthright, didn't he? Think of any others.
Isaac actually wasn't.
Yeah. Who was Abraham's firstborn son? Ishmael. But he didn't get the birthright, did he? Isaac got it instead. Any more that you can think of? Well, here we got Joseph right here, right? That's a pretty good example of it. Reuben was supposed to get it, but Joseph winds up doing it, or getting it. You look back, it's pretty interesting when you start looking back through the lineage of man, you'll see God choosing these individuals, lining them up for this godly lineage through whom Christ is going to come. And there was a reason why he picked who he picked. Esau wouldn't have been a very good descendant of Jesus, would he? He was a worldly guy. And so God chose these people, and the choices that he made aren't always the choices that man would make. So it's kind of interesting. Take a little time, go back through, look through the book of Genesis, and see how many times you can see that come to pass. Question number 9 here. What does Jacob say whenever he blesses Joseph?
First of all, he gave us a blessing.
Yeah, he begins the blessing by calling upon God. And of course, one of the things that he points out is this is the same God that, revealed himself to my grandfather Abraham, same God that revealed himself to my father Isaac, and he also revealed himself to me. And, one of the things that Jacob points out is God had fed him. Now I think Haston, when he talked about Psalm 23, he did a pretty good job there. Well, he did a really good job there talking about the idea of shepherding. But that's the Hebrew word for shepherding. God had been his shepherd. He'd fed him. He'd brought him along. He'd watched over him. He protected. He provided for him. He kept him from evil and harm. And so Jacob is calling upon this same God to look after Joseph and his 2 sons. And he asked God to do 2 great things for him, to acknowledge Joseph's sons as his sons, as the sons of Israel, as tribes in Israel. And God does that, doesn't he? We know that whenever they inherit the promised land, the way it's divided up, God recognizes that. God acknowledges them as in the place of Joseph. And then he also asked God to make of them a great multitude of people. Now, of course, that's going to come to pass whenever they, by the time they come up out of the land of Egypt. So let's talk a little bit about the blessing upon Manasseh and Ephraim here. Question number 10. What concerned Joseph and what did he ask Jacob to do about it? Yeah, Joseph apparently, I don't know if he wasn't looking before or he was just, not going to say anything and hope his father figured it out. But apparently either enough time had passed or else he looks up and he realizes what's going on and that Jacob's hands are crossed and that he's blessing the wrong person. The blessing that was supposed to be for the firstborn was actually being given to his youngest son. And so Joseph thought his father was making a mistake, took his hand and was going to move it over to Manasseh's head, telling his father, what was happening. How does Jacob respond to Joseph's request? Yeah, he says, son, I know what I'm doing. I may be old and senile and blind, but I know what I'm doing. Okay? I know what's happening here. And he points out the reason that he's doing this, of course, this is a prophecy. When you read about this blessing that Jacob puts upon all of his sons, what he said would happen to him happens, just like he said. But he points out, he reassures Joseph. He says, listen, Manasseh they're going to be a great people, but Ephraim is going to be great. And when you look at the northern tribe, whenever Israel split into the northern and the southern kingdom, Ephraim was made up a multitude of that particular nation. In fact, when you go through the prophets, some of the prophets, you'll find that the number of Ephraim was so great that the northern kingdom is actually called Ephraim several times by the prophets themselves. And so Jacob prophetically, divinely revealed, knew this was going to happen. He said this nation's going to be, or this tribe's going to be greater than the other tribe, and so the blessing is going to be put upon them. Ephraim would become the most powerful tribe in the northern kingdom, though. Question number 12. What did Jacob tell Joseph concerning their future living place? Yeah, remember that's what God told him before he went down into Egypt. Where was it? Was it Beersheba, wherever God appeared to him before he goes down into Egypt? I can't remember that far back. But remember, he appears to him there and he said, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to go down into Egypt. I'm going to make of you a great nation down there, and I'm going to bring you out. And I'm going to give you the promised land whenever I bring you out. And so Jacob's telling Joseph, hey, don't forget, we've got this land that's waiting for us. Now, why do you think he would tell Joseph that? They were in a pretty good position where they were right then and there, weren't they? And so he looking at it probably thought, this could become tempting for them to just say, hey, we've got it good down here, let's just stay. Providence of God put some things in order, use some things that man would do to kind of motivate him a little bit to get out of Egypt, right? Yeah, but things were good at this point in time, and Jacob didn't want them to forget, this isn't where we're supposed to be forever. God has a land that's waiting for us, and one day we're going to come out of here and we're going to inherit that land. Question 13 here, why did Jacob care where he was buried? Okay? He wanted to be buried with the rest of his family, right? But was it just the fact that his family was there?
That was a symbol of promises and heritage.
Yeah. I think Jacob, when you read about him, we don't have time to read Hebrews 11, but go over there and read about it and the statement that he made about his bones coming out of that land. But he believed God's promise about the future, didn't he? He believed that they were going to inherit that land. That's something he learned throughout the ages. God does what he tells you he's going to do. And so he says, we're going to inherit that land one day, and when we do, I want you to take my body and bury it in that promised land. And I think he wanted his burial to, I think he wanted people to remember that, keep that on their mind. We're going to get out of here one day. When we do, we're supposed to take Jacob's bones with us and bury him over there. But he wanted his burial, I think, to speak to future generations and descendants and to remind them that God had given them, truly these great promises. Question 14, why is it important to keep one's promises? I think we all know the importance of that, the answer to that. We're supposed to be people who are honest, who are trustworthy. That's who Christ was when he was here upon this earth, and he wants us to do the same. This is a good question. 15. When is it easy to keep promises?
When it's easy to do.
Yeah, when it's not hard to do. I think another thing too is accountability. If you know you're going to be held accountable if you don't keep that promise, are you more apt to do it? I mean, if you go out and you buy a car and you don't make your payments, what's going to happen? You're going to be held accountable, right? Go out and you buy a house, sign the note, make a promise, and we'll make these payments. You don't make them. There are consequences, right? And so we know if we don't keep our promise, there are consequences that are going to come because of it. When's it easy to break a promise? I think when there aren't any immediate consequences, don't you? Unfortunately, that's the way a lot of people think about God. They think they can do all these things and promise God all this stuff and then not keep their promises, and then they don't have to worry about it. But it's going to catch up with them in the end, isn't it? What was Joseph given? 16, and why? End of the chapter here, verse 22. Yeah, he got an unexpected gift that day, and that was a piece of land that Jacob had taken from the Amorites in Bethel. That's kind of an interesting place because it comes into play in the New Testament. Remember in John chapter 4 at Jacob's well, the Samaritan woman? That's probably the place that Jacob had taken from the Amorites in Bethel that was given to Joseph. But it's kind of interesting that was at least one piece of land that he did own, and a lot of people believe that's probably where his forefathers were buried too. So, all right, anybody got any thoughts, comments, anything before we end tonight?